What happens when success makes you a target? Not criticism, not media pressure, something far darker. In the middle of building his future, Shedeur Sanders became the focus of a crime that wasn't random, wasn't sloppy, and definitely wasn't accidental. This wasn't a broken window or a spur-of-the-moment mistake. It was calculated, planned, executed across state lines by people who knew exactly what they were looking for. When news first broke that Shedeur's home had been invaded, most people assumed it was just another unfortunate story that comes with fame. But that assumption couldn't be further from the truth, because what investigators would later reveal paints a much more disturbing picture, one involving coordinated travel, surveillance, rental cars, hotel stays, and suspects with violent histories. This wasn't about opportunity. This was about selection. Shedeur Sanders isn't just another young quarterback. He's visible, he's confident, he gives back. He carries himself like a leader long before he's fully stepped into the NFL spotlight. And for reasons that should concern everyone watching, that visibility may have put him directly in the crosshairs. Over $200,000 worth of personal property was taken. Luxury items, personal belongings, things that go beyond money and hit much closer to home. And here's the part that should stop you cold. 3 suspects are in custody. 1 is still on the run. Police have labeled them dangerous. Guns were involved. Prior crimes were uncovered. This could have ended very differently. So the real question isn't just who did this. It's why it happened, how close it came to becoming something far worse, and what this says about the reality young athletes are walking into today. Because this story doesn't start with football, and it definitely doesn't end with arrests. At first glance, this could have looked like another high-profile break-in. A wealthy athlete, an empty house, expensive items gone. But investigators quickly realized something didn't add up. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime. Every detail pointed to planning, patience, and coordination. And that's when the case shifted from local concern to something much bigger. According to law enforcement, everything traces back to Cleveland, where the incident occurred in mid-November. The suspects didn't just happen to be nearby. Reports claim they traveled across state lines, arriving the night before the burglary. They checked into a hotel. They rented a vehicle. Surveillance cameras later showed them entering and exiting the property with purpose. No hesitation, no panic. That kind of confidence only comes when someone believes they've already done their homework. Detectives say license plate readers were the first major crack in the case. Once that rental car was flagged, the timeline began to unravel fast. Hotel footage confirmed the suspects' movements. Neighboring cameras filled in the gaps. Digital records placed them exactly where police needed them, minute by minute. What initially looked like a clean escape suddenly turned into a breadcrumb trail. And then came the part that made investigators pause. Authorities suggested this group didn't just stumble onto one home. Reports indicate they targeted high-end individuals, people with visibility, money, and predictable schedules. That detail changes everything, because it raises a chilling possibility. Someone may have been feeding information from the outside. Whether that was through social media tracking, word of mouth, or something more deliberate hasn't been proven. But detectives openly stated they believe guidance was involved. Even more alarming, when arrests were eventually made in Georgia, officers recovered firearms, illegal substances, and uncovered violent criminal histories. These weren't low-level offenders. One officer didn't hesitate when asked if the suspects were dangerous. His answer was blunt: yes. And here's the part that lingers. One suspect is still out there. An active warrant, felony charges. Law enforcement has asked for the public's help, which means this story isn't closed, it's still unfolding. But what makes this moment hit harder is realizing how close this came to becoming something far worse. Property can be replaced, peace of mind can't. And that realization forces an uncomfortable question. What happens when success makes you visible, but protection doesn't keep pace? Because what investigators uncovered next only deepens that concern. What made this situation resonate far beyond one neighborhood wasn't just the crime itself. It was what it exposed about life off the field for young, high-profile athletes. This wasn't a smash-and grab. It was a wake-up call. And once investigators began speaking publicly, the implications became impossible to ignore. Law enforcement confirmed that the suspects weren't first-time offenders. During arrests, officers recovered weapons, uncovered outstanding warrants, and connected the group to other burglaries across state lines. One case reportedly involved suspects fleeing with firearms in hand. That detail alone shifted the tone of the conversation. This wasn't about stolen property anymore. This was about real danger, real consequences. And the reality that if timing had been different, this could have turned into a headline no one wants to imagine. What stands out is how deliberately this was executed. Surveillance footage showed calm movements, no rush, no panic. These individuals believed they had control of the situation. Investigators even acknowledged that alarms not going off immediately didn't stop them from pushing forward. That level of confidence suggests experience and possibly previous success doing the same thing elsewhere. This is where the broader NFL conversation begins. Players are drafted, traded, and relocated into new cities every year. They're taught how to handle media, finances, and branding. But stories like this raise an uncomfortable question. How much are they taught about personal security? Because visibility is a double-edged sword. Social media shows routines. Location tags reveal patterns. Success signals opportunity, not just to fans, but to the wrong people watching quietly. What makes this case even more unsettling is that investigators hinted this wasn't isolated. When asked whether these suspects were linked to other high-profile targets, officials didn't deny it. They simply said those details weren't public yet. That pause spoke volumes. It suggests other cases may still be under wraps, other victims staying silent, other athletes dealing with similar situations behind closed doors. And through all of this, the response from the player at the center of it has been telling. No public meltdown, no online outrage, no distractions. He allowed law enforcement to work, stayed focused, and kept moving forward. That composure matters, because it highlights the mental resilience required to handle pressures most people never see. This case didn't just expose criminals, it exposed a gap, a space between fame and protection that's growing wider as athletes become more visible than ever. And as the investigation continues, one question looms larger than the rest. How many others are at risk right now, without even realizing it? What finally cracked this case open wasn't luck, it was persistence. The kind of slow, methodical work that doesn't make headlines until the end, but changes everything once it does. Investigators made it clear during the press conference that this wasn't solved overnight. It took months of piecing together fragments that, on their own, meant nothing. Together, they told the whole story. It started with something small, a neighbor's camera catching a vehicle that didn't belong, not a clear face, not a dramatic moment, just movement. Then came license plate reader data, quietly logging a rental car that passed through at the wrong time. That single detail turned into a thread investigators could pull. Once they traced the rental, the dominoes started falling fast. Hotel records placed the suspects in the area the night before. Surveillance footage confirmed they checked in calmly, no disguises, no urgency. That alone told detectives this wasn't random. These men expected to get away with it. Digital forensics added another layer. Cell phone data, movement patterns, timing that lined up too perfectly to ignore. Suddenly, the suspects weren't just shadows on video. They had names, histories, and connections stretching across state lines. What's important here is how many agencies became involved. This didn't stay local. Sheriff's offices coordinated with Georgia authorities. Federal resources were pulled in. Digital tracking specialists joined the effort. That level of response sends a message. This case was treated as a priority, not because of fame, but because of the threat level. Officers openly stated these suspects were dangerous, not possibly dangerous. That distinction matters. And yet, even with arrests made, the case isn't finished. One suspect remains at large, an active felony warrant. Law enforcement didn't soften their language, they want help finding him. That alone adds tension, because until every piece is resolved, there's no full closure, no sense of finality. Another detail that stood out was the admission that most of the stolen property may never be recovered. Over $200,000 in personal belongings gone. Not just expensive items, but things tied to daily life, items with memories attached. That kind of loss doesn't disappear once arrests are made. It lingers. What this investigation revealed isn't just how criminals operate. It revealed how exposed high-visibility individuals can be. Cameras helped, technology helped, patience helped. But the reality is, the damage had already been done before any of that kicked in. And that's where the conversation shifts again. Because solving the crime is one thing, preventing the next one is another. And the uncomfortable truth is this case may only be one piece of a much larger pattern that hasn't fully surfaced yet. At some point, this story stops being about a single break-in and starts revealing something far more uncomfortable. Because the deeper investigators went, the clearer one truth became. This wasn't opportunity, it was selection. And that distinction matters more than people realize. Law enforcement used a phrase during the press conference that should have set off alarms for anyone paying attention. They said the suspects targeted high-end individuals. Not neighborhoods, not convenience, individuals. That means research, observation, pattern recognition. These weren't people wandering around hoping a door was unlocked. They were watching, waiting, choosing. Think about how visible modern athletes are. Social media shows homes, routines, workouts, travel schedules. Location tags expose when someone isn't home. Interviews reveal where players live, train, and spend time. None of it feels dangerous in the moment. It feels like branding, connection, access. But in the wrong hands, that visibility becomes a roadmap. That's the hidden cost nobody talks about. Success today isn't quiet, it's loud. And while fans see inspiration, criminals see opportunity. Investigators hinted that these suspects had done this before. Other burglaries, other victims, some cases still not public. That suggests a system, a repeatable method. And if that's true, then this case isn't an outlier, it's a warning. What makes this especially disturbing is how calculated the timing was. The suspects traveled across state lines, stayed overnight, and moved with confidence. That tells you they believed the risk was low. That belief doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from experience, from prior attempts where nothing happened, from systems that haven't fully caught up to the reality of modern fame. This is where the responsibility question enters the conversation. Teams spend millions protecting players on the field. Film study, play design, injury prevention. But off the field, protection is often treated as optional, left to personal choices, personal spending, personal awareness. And not every young athlete fully understands the risks until something like this happens. The most sobering part is asking the question no one wants to say out loud. What if someone had been home? Police confirmed these suspects had violent histories. Firearms were involved in other cases. This could have turned tragic in seconds. That's not speculation, that's math. And yet, despite all of this, the response from the victim has been calm, measured, and disciplined. No public fear, no visible panic, just forward motion. That says something about mindset, about maturity, about leadership under pressure. But it also raises the bigger issue. If someone this prepared, this aware, and this disciplined can be targeted, then who's next? And what does that say about how exposed the next generation of high-profile athletes really is? As the investigation unfolded, the tone shifted from concern to urgency. What initially looked like a high-profile burglary quickly exposed a much larger pattern, one that forced law enforcement to treat this case differently from the start. This wasn't about stolen property anymore. It was about preventing the next incident. Detectives began piecing together the timeline with uncomfortable precision. Rental car records showed the suspects didn't just arrive and improvise. They checked in the night before. Surveillance footage placed them in the area long before the break-in. License plate readers tracked their movement in and out with alarming clarity. This was a dry run followed by execution. And once investigators realized that, every resource came online. That's why this case drew attention from multiple agencies. Local sheriffs, out-of-state departments, and federal partners weren't brought in for show. They were brought in because the suspects weren't operating in isolation. Officers confirmed connections to prior burglaries, some involving firearms. Others involved flight from police. This wasn't a first offense. It was a pattern repeating itself until it crossed the wrong line. One detail from the press conference quietly changed the entire conversation. When asked why federal resources were involved, the response was simple: digital tracking and interstate coordination. Phones, vehicle data, hotel records, camera networks. Every step left a trail. And once those threads were pulled together, the case cracked open faster than anyone expected. But even with arrests made, there was no victory lap. Investigators openly admitted that most of the stolen property may never be recovered. That reality hits harder than people think. It's not about money. It's about violation. About knowing strangers walked through your space, touched your life, and disappeared. That doesn't reset overnight. What stood out most, though, was how the situation was handled behind the scenes. There were no leaks from the victim's camp, no public commentary meant to sway opinion, just patience, trust in the process, and discipline. That restraint allowed law enforcement to do their job without pressure, and the results speak for themselves. Multiple suspects identified, arrested, and charged. Still, one name remains unresolved. One suspect is still out there, and that fact keeps this story unfinished. Authorities made it clear they're not slowing down. Tips are being followed. Leads are active. The net is tightening. Here's the real takeaway. This investigation worked because of technology, cooperation, and persistence. But it also exposed how thin the margin is between safety and chaos for people living in the spotlight. If this case had gone unsolved, the message to criminals would have been dangerous. Instead, it sent a different signal. You can run, you can hide, but eventually the system catches up. And what happened next only reinforced why this moment matters far beyond one player. What stood out most in the aftermath wasn't the press conference, the arrests, or even the scale of the investigation. It was the response, or more accurately, the restraint. In an era where every moment becomes content and every setback gets monetized, Shedeur Sanders did the opposite. He went quiet, and that choice said more than any statement ever could. There was no emotional outburst online, no cryptic posts, no attempt to turn sympathy into leverage. He didn't frame himself as a victim or use the moment to control the narrative. Instead, he let law enforcement work, kept his head down, and stayed focused on what he's always focused on: preparation, growth, and the next step forward. That kind of discipline isn't accidental, it's learned. Behind the scenes, people close to the situation say he handled it with a level of maturity that surprised even those who know him well. This wasn't denial or avoidance. It was control. Understanding that reacting publicly wouldn't undo what happened, but staying locked in would protect what matters most: his future. That matters because moments like this can derail careers. They shake routines. They disrupt focus. They introduce fear where confidence needs to live. For a young quarterback already under a microscope, this could have become a distraction spiral. Instead, it became a test of character, and how he handled it quietly reshaped how people inside football view him. There's a misconception that leadership is loud. That strength means speaking first, posting fastest, reacting hardest. But real leadership often shows up as composure when chaos is justified. By choosing silence, Shedeur didn't ignore the moment. He absorbed it, processed it, and moved forward without letting it define him. That doesn't mean it didn't affect him. Anyone who's had their personal space violated knows that feeling lingers. But the difference here is how it was channeled. Instead of turning inward or outward, it sharpened his focus. Training continued. Preparation didn't slow. The routine stayed intact. That's not avoidance, that's resilience. And it sends a message, whether intentional or not, to teammates, to evaluators, to younger players watching. Adversity doesn't excuse you from responsibility. Pressure doesn't grant permission to lose discipline. If anything, it demands more of it. This moment didn't change who Shedeur Sanders is. It revealed it. Calm under stress, measured in response, focused when distractions would have been understandable. And as this story continues to unfold, one thing is already clear. What was taken from him didn't take anything essential. But what came next would show just how much this moment might shape the way he moves forward, both on and off the field. Once you step back from the headlines and arrests, a harder truth starts to take shape. What happened to Shedeur Sanders wasn't random. It wasn't bad luck, and it wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a growing pattern that the league, teams, and fans haven't fully confronted yet. Young NFL stars are becoming targets the moment visibility meets access. Think about it. Players today aren't hidden behind anonymity the way they once were. Social media shows where they train, how they live, what they wear, and sometimes even where they stay. Success is public. Movement is traceable. And for the wrong people, that visibility looks like opportunity. Criminals don't see a quarterback grinding for his future. They see perceived wealth, predictability, and absence. Law enforcement made one thing clear during the press conference. These suspects didn't stumble onto Shedeur Sanders' home. They selected it. They studied patterns. They crossed state lines. They stayed overnight. That's not impulse. That's intent. And that should unsettle every young athlete entering the league. Most rookies are trained on playbooks, media questions, and financial planning. But personal security, that's often left vague. Be careful. Stay alert. General advice for a very specific risk. The reality is, fame accelerates vulnerability faster than experience can catch up. Players move to new cities, new neighborhoods, unfamiliar surroundings, all while being instantly recognizable. That gap is where danger lives. What makes this even more troubling is that these crimes often stay quiet. Not every case gets a press conference. Not every player wants the attention. Some handle it privately. Some never speak on it. And that silence creates the illusion that it's rare, when in reality, it's underreported. The involvement of federal agencies in this case should raise eyebrows. This wasn't treated like a routine burglary because it wasn't one. Interstate coordination, digital tracking, organized suspects, guns recovered. That's a level of seriousness that points to something larger than one incident. It forces an uncomfortable question. Is the league doing enough to prepare players for life off the field? Protection doesn't just mean offensive lines and blitz pickups. It means awareness, education, understanding how quickly routine can become risk. Because once a pattern is established, when criminals believe athletes are easy targets, it doesn't stop on its own. Shedeur Sanders didn't choose visibility. It came with the path he's walked his entire life. But what this situation exposes is that success, without safeguards, can turn into exposure. And until that reality is addressed head-on, this won't be the last story like this. The scary part isn't what already happened. It's what could happen next if nothing changes. When the dust settles and the headlines fade, what happened to Shedeur Sanders stands for something far larger than a single burglary or a single athlete. This wasn't just about stolen property, arrest reports, or press conferences. It was a wake-up call. At its core, this situation exposed how thin the line is between success and vulnerability in today's NFL. Shedeur did everything right. He stayed focused. He didn't escalate the moment online. He trusted law enforcement. He kept working. And yet, none of that prevented criminals from identifying him, tracking his movements and targeting his home with precision. That reality should make everyone pause. Because if it can happen to someone as disciplined, aware, and structured as Shedeur Sanders, it can happen to anyone stepping into the spotlight. This case forces a broader conversation the league can no longer avoid. The NFL invests millions into protecting players on the field, but the modern threat isn't just physical contact between the lines. It's off-field exposure, social media visibility, predictable routines, and criminals who understand exactly how to exploit those gaps. Fame now moves faster than protection, and that imbalance is dangerous. What makes this even heavier is the symbolism. Shedeur represents a new generation of players, confident, visible, business-minded, engaged with the community. He doesn't hide from the spotlight, he understands it. And yet, that same openness became a liability. That's not a failure on his part. That's a system that hasn't fully adapted to the reality of modern athletes. The encouraging part of this story is accountability. Faces were shown, names were released, arrests were made, technology worked, persistence mattered, and law enforcement proved that even organized operations leave trails. That matters not just for justice but for deterrence. But accountability, after the fact, isn't enough. The real lesson here is prevention, education, awareness, making security part of the conversation before something goes wrong, not after. Because the emotional weight of knowing your space was violated doesn't disappear when suspects are arrested. That stays with you. It changes how you move, how you trust, how you feel in your own home. Shedeur Sanders will move forward. That much is clear. He's shown that adversity doesn't derail him, it sharpens him. But this moment should stay with fans, teams, and the league itself, not as fear but as awareness. This wasn't just a crime. It was a message about the cost of visibility in today's world. And the question now is whether Shedeur will bounce back. He will. The real question is whether the system around young athletes will evolve fast enough to make sure this doesn't keep happening again.